Morning, everyone. I'm Nisha Lawson, Membership Services Coordinator for the Ohio Fire Chiefs Association. Thank you for joining us for this morning's Answer Presumption or Not webinar, presented by Assistant Chief Jack Rupp of the Plain Township Fire Department. If you have any questions, we will answer them at the end of the presentation. You can either raise your hand or type questions into the question bar, and we will get those answered for you. And now I will turn it over to Chief Rupp.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our brief webinar here about cancer presumption. And one of the things I wanted to say is I'm really surprised with the number of people that turned out this morning. On my way to work this morning, I got on 33 heading towards 270, and normally I'd stop and go, and I'm looking at the light traffic, and I figured we'd end up and only have a few people, but the number I don't appear is too bad at this point. First of all, I want to at least touch a little bit about the Safety, Health, and Wellness Committee. The association decided in October of 2015 that we were in need of somebody to oversee some of these things that the association can become involved in, and at that point that I accepted the chair position in that. And one of the things we did was divide the work groups up, developed a charter in that and what our goals and objectives were, and we divided into work groups so that we could get things accomplished. And our behavioral health work group, we have a cancer work group, an occupational work group, and a PPE work group, and just recently a social media work group so that we can get information out to the members. And one of the things, we had a number of goals this year, and one of them was collaborative efforts with behavioral health. But the other thing was that we have the pre-conference issue of In Command is devoted to health and safety, and we have 5 articles that will appear in that edition. One of them being behavioral health collaboration, and Will Anderson heads that group, and he had done a study that we conducted last year that was a cooperative effort between the association and the Ohio Professional Firefighters. And we're expanding on that this year. We realize that not only do we, but the professional firefighters and the Ohio State firefighters, that we have to have one voice when we're dealing with PTSD and behavioral health. So he's working hard. They've met at least once. They've had some conference calls, and they're moving in a collaborative measure, so we have one voice that way. One of the other articles is going to be on annual physicals and the need and the concern for annual physicals because of the line of duty deaths, and establishing cancer baselines. One of them is sleep deprivation. Nathan Murray is going to do one Murphy from Worcester is doing one on sleep deprivation, and I'm going to end up and mention the circadian rhythms when we talk about the Group 1 carcinogens in the International Agency for Cancer Research. Another article is going to be on fire service culture and the changes there, and then naturally there's going to be one in there on presumption. So with our new social media efforts in that, you can follow the committee at wellness_safety, and don't forget to follow the fire chiefs at OFCA 450. Well, all of a sudden I have a problem here. I can't advance my slides. Nice. Hang with me a minute. There we go. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about the legislation in that. The legislation went on for a number of years, as many of you know, and the Ohio professional firefighters shouldered much of the responsibility, much of the work. They shouldered all the expense to bring in expert witnesses during the testimony phase of the legislation over that period. I think the turning point for the legislation was when the professional firefighters and our association came together along with the Ohio State firefighters. Michelle worked very closely with the professional firefighters and Jim Carney to go through the language and come up with agreeable, amendable language as we worked through it. And there was a number of challenges with the Ohio Municipal League in terms of that language. One of the things is I was a novice at this, and one of the things that I learned was that Michelle's a master at negotiating and working through the halls of the State House and working with the legislators. And I think that played a huge part, and we're very fortunate to have Michelle on our side. We met with Senator Paxton, who is now a House representative. He sponsored the Senate Bill 27. And then we also met and had conference calls with both of them and Representative Henney, who was a representative on the Insurance House Committee, and took it upon himself to help get it out of committee and onto the floor, and he did a good job that way. One of the additions that we worked really hard for from the Safety, Health, and Wellness Committee and took forward on behalf of the fire chiefs was a piece of legislation, a new piece to the bill, which we wanted data for the future. We knew that the bill was going to undergo changes in the future because they were trying to put changes immediately as we went through the final processes. And we knew that the only way that we could get the right changes in the future as changes occur, that we needed to have some data. And that came as a result of our research. We tried to do research and find information from other states that had already passed presumption, and it was difficult. And most states, have their worker comp through privately held insurance companies. And so that presented some problems in being able to come up and find data. And so Ohio is unique that we have a statute-funded workers' compensation system in that. And so we felt because it was legislated that we would have an opportunity to be able to come up with data and help guide us in the future. All right, now a little bit about the legislation is that there were two pieces of legislation that affected the cancer presumption. One occurred in the 131st General Assembly, and then again in the 132nd General Assembly. And in the 131st, that was the Senate Bill 27 that was sponsored by Senator Patton at that time, and it referred to two sections in that bill. The ORC, or Section 74238, is Ohio Police and Firemen's Pension Fund, and it basically referred to qualifications, pretty much the same language that went into the BWC side of it, and the disability side of it. Then with sections 412357 and 412368, those were actually the sections that the requirements for allowing the cancer claims entered into. And 412368 is actually the occupational disease section in the ORC that we'll see and talk a little bit about later, and that's where the requirements reside. And then the new one was 412386, which was accepted and enacted that the BWC needed to prepare a report regarding the cancer claims every 2 years once the legislation was enacted, so that we had good data in the future to go forward as we decided that we needed to change the law or make any additions. The second piece that we saw was in the General Assembly 132, and that was House Bill 27, and that was considered the BWC appropriation bill. And there were three portions there. And one of the things that it did in the 74238, which is the Police and Firemen's Pension Fund, and for when that originally came out, there were a lot of volunteers in the Ohio State Firefighters Association thought that they may be exempted from the bill, and they weren't being exempted from the bill. There was no intent to exempt them, but they had to be referenced in there for the Police and Firemen's Pension Fund and how they would deal with cancer presumption and claims for retirements and disabilities. In 68, the .68 additional rebuttal language was offered, And one of the things that the Ohio Municipal League had tried to get into some of the original language was that a preponderance of the evidence to bear that the general causation and association to the carcinogen designated of one or more out of the IRAC. So they wanted pretty significant language in terms of preponderance of the evidence. And so with going back and forth with them and with the Ohio Professional Firefighters, they came up with this preponderance of competent scientific evidence. What that really means at this point, you know, it's really hard to say. It puts the burden not on the injured worker. It puts the burden back onto whoever's going to do the rebuttal, and generally the city or maybe the department, something like that, and where it fits into the alleged carcinogens that they are, you know, they did not cause the alleged cancer. The other change was that, again, and these were by the chairman, Brinkman, the other change was that originally there was a 20-year stipulation that you could be last assigned hazardous duty, and that was reduced to 15. They were concerned about the number of claims that might open up the BWC to. And the other thing, the last section, the 416701, was actually an amendment that BWC sought because they were going to have the increase cancer claims and the increase in dealing with cancer in claims. They wanted some ability to be able to help in terms of the regulation of the programs. And so they worked to and asked to have that section, which is the Public Employee Risk Reduction Program, which the fire service and EMS and a number of agencies, law enforcement agencies, and the correction officers were all exempt from that section of the Ohio Revised Code. And basically, while Ohio is not a OSHA state for public employees, this was BWC's program to have some regulation over the safety of employees, public employees. So that exemption that we have previously had in the Public Employee Risk Reduction Program, that exemption was now removed, and we are now responsible for the involvement in that Public Employee Risk Reduction Program. So if you're not familiar with that, you can reach out to the BWC. There's a lot of information out there. Some of the various districts have some of the representatives in to try to educate us on that program. So now to go over the policy a little bit is that one of the things that they did develop the policy that is right around the cancer as an occupational disease, and that .68 of 4123 is the occupational disease section, so it fits in there. The other thing that is a kind of a boilerplate language is hazardous duty. If you go through BWC and you look at the information that they have about hazardous duty, is that this is the boilerplate language that the duties performed under circumstances which an accident could result in serious injury and usually death. If you look at what we've said, and we talk about presumption, and I think a lot of firefighters, when presumption was passed, believe that just purely because they are a firefighter and working in a hazardous duty situation, that any cancer that may come across, that they will have presumption and it will be covered by BWC. And this clause says, you know, and it's right in the beginning of the policy, is that the injured worker has the burden and must submit evidence that establishes that the causation, the presumption causation, was met. And it goes on further to talk about it being as a result of their occupation and their service. The BWC developed a new form, and that form was the C65 Form. And it basically, if in the center, and I don't know how well you can see it or read it, but basically in the center, it only has 17 of the cancer-causing agents that they felt were important. And when I talked about the sleep deprivation, one of the listing agents or activities in the IRAC is a work shift, and that involves circadian rhythm disruption. So I think that was one of the things anybody on shift should include, in the description of their possible causation. Of those 17, there's actually 698 agents that are in the Group 1 and Group 2A classifications from the International Agency for Cancer Research. And Group 1 basically is agents that are known to cause cancer, so anything that's been established through research as a cancer-causing agent. The 2A group is agents that will probably cause cancer, that there's evidence that they cause cancer, but it hasn't actually been determined and they haven't been listed to be as a known cancer-causing agent. The other thing that they don't mention, that if you look at the research around firefighters and that, is the VOX, which is the volatile organic compounds. You'll see a lot of that in the reports that are coming out of the Illinois Fire Service Institute and the research that they did and the testing that they did with firefighters in 2015. And the other one that they did a lot and we see a lot of is the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, or the PAHs, which is what we're finding in a lot of the chemicals used in fire retardants. So those are all things I think that should be listed in. And if somebody would go through there, they may select these, but in an other, they need to probably list a narrative to go associated with that, including a lot of those things out of research. All right. Oh. I skipped over one of them, but the other one is actually, let's see if I can go back. Yep. Okay, this is the first report of injury, and that first report of injury is required as well as what we do with any other injuries that we see on the fire ground. And on the firefighter's part, there is a description. There really isn't an accident, but there is a need for supporting data. And one of if you look at it closely, it talks about subsequent events that contributed. And so documentation definitely is going to help. So in those subsequent events or sequence of events, the run history, exposure logs, summarizing the language possibly of toxic smoke environments, referring to research papers would be what we would want to see included in those areas to help with the presumption. Also, there's a section for the physician, and I think that with the practitioners, it becomes really, really important that they just don't list the type of cancer, but they list a narrative that supports that the type of cancer listed was contracted as the performance of their duty, and potentially a time and date range that they felt that this occurred. So when the policy goes on further, it has that presumes that the firefighter has contracted it, and again, it's when they've met these conditions. So there is those stipulations that you have, that it's just not a presumption based upon your job as a firefighter. You have to go through these stipulations or met these conditions. And naturally, the conditions are that they worked as a firefighter, that they've been, it's been a minimum of 6 years. An interesting piece that came out of one of the approval of the claims was out of Columbus, and Mark Ryan, and he was 68 or 86 days short of his 6 years. But through the appeal process and the evidence he had, and the support of the physicians, and the physicians being able to document that well, that he finally went through and it was approved. So that's kind of is some interesting pieces that we may have, and may, maybe we'll see changes in the future as far as that. the exposure. And one of the things that originally was in the original legislation was that as a result of the research that was out there and the cancers in that research that were listed as being seen in higher frequencies in firefighters, a lot of specific cancers were listed. And that was one of the things that the Ohio Municipal League didn't want to see. But actually, you know, they were one of the proponents of the International Agency for Research Cancer, including the Group 1 and Group 2A carcinogens. And that actually opens it up to a larger number of cancers based upon, you know, those carcinogens that are available. The other piece is that it's being diagnosed by a provider, cancer by a physician, and that the firefighter was first diagnosed and first treated or first quit on or after the initiation of the original legislation, which was April 6th of 2017. And there were enough people that came back. And again, the reason for that, BWC, I think, wanted to reduce their risk of the number of claims. But the legislation never said that there was an enactment point. And so as part of the House Bill 27 and the appropriation bill, that was corrected. And it came back to say then that the first diagnosis received in treatment prior to April 6th of 2017. And they did not have to quit due to the disease, was eligible for consideration. So the other piece is that there's the rebuttal, and this is, you know, where that presumption goes away. And there's a couple of pieces in there that I think that we all agreed on, but I think there's pieces that are concerning as well that people need to understand, firefighters and the administrators need to understand. And of course, the 70 years of age or older, just because of the general life and cancers that are available based upon age occurring over time, that was a factor for a rebuttal. So if you're still actively involved and you're 70 or 72 years of age in the fire service, BWC, just because of that, may be able to rebut that, or your agency may be able to, or the city may be able to rebut that just based on age. The 15-year that was reduced to 15 years, and the latency period that a lot of the research said in terms of cancers and the development of cancers really is about a 10-year window. So all of those involved felt that it was okay to go from the 20-year to the 15 years in terms of the claims availability. The injured worker exposed to cigarettes and tobacco products or other conditions present a high risk of development of the alleged cancer. So this kind of opens up things quite a bit. I know there's a lot of departments that don't have tobacco policies. And so whether you have a smoking policy, but firefighters still use dip, which probably is a lot of the cases in that, that would be a reason for BWC or the city or the township or whoever to come back and rebut whatever that cancer may be as not being, you know, firefighting may not being the cause of that particular cancer. The other consideration is that what does the employee do on their day off? Do they work in a body shop? Are they exposed to chemicals in a body shop? Do they possibly work for a hazardous chemical abatement company? You know, so there's other considerations there that could rebut them, and people need to think about in terms of their description and their narratives, and be prepared to provide the necessary documentation that it was a fire service related cancer. And if the evidence that becomes that the firefighters incurred the alleged cancer becoming before becoming a firefighter. So that's where your annual physicals and your baseline physicals would help in that situation that they did not. They were cancer-free in terms of their employment with the department. And then in 3, again, they talk about if the conditions are established that presumption is listed according to that section has been met and the evidence has not been submitted to rebut the presumption, then BWC will allow the claim. So once again, they reinforce that there's got to be evidence on the part of the claimant and that there has to be no rebuttal against that claim. It also goes on to say down at the bottom, and it talks about that if there's presumption is not met, that the rebuttal that is outlined in that section, the BWC will refer to the occupational disease claim policy. But this is housed in that policy. So when you look at that language in that policy, it comes out of 412368, and it's pretty much the same language right along. In this section, it just basically talks about the compensation of the firefighter with presumption is allowed. So it talks about the temporary total disability and the permanent and death, and then it follows along with those claims or those disabilities just right along with the regular BWC policies. All right, so, is it presumption or not? And in most cases, when you look at other presumption in other states, the term presumption, you may say that, gee, we really don't have presumption because we've got to go through all these steps, but it is presumption, and you need to be prepared. The administrators and members need to understand that presumption is only presumed with those stipulations, those conditions that we talked about. And the BWC states that an injured worker, and this is common with any injury or any of the occupational diseases, that the burden of proof must be submitted and evidence to establish that presumption or causation be met. So be prepared, be prepared to present a case of that presumption. It's probably very difficult if you talk to anybody that submitted claims now. After the fact, it's very difficult to wait until you've been diagnosed with cancer to go back and accumulate this data that you need. So how do we establish the burden of proof? I think that departments need to look at, one, their medical entry physicals and a cancer-free baseline. And annual physicals. An annual physical will help to show a timeline to where the employee, the firefighter, remains cancer-free, and include and consider the inclusion of dermatology exams, because we know that the melanomas are something that we're seeing, possibly cancer markers, and we're seeing more DNA testing in terms of looking at cells and looking at DNA and looking for mutation in the DNA to see if there could be risk of future cancers. So the testing is becoming more and more technical and more revealing in terms of what it has. Now, those DNA testings come with a significant price at this point, but sometime it may come down. One of the things with BWC and the PERP piece to include the employee risk reduction program is cancer prevention policy. So we need to make certain that we have those cancer prevention policy and exposure prevention, and what measures we're taking in the station to reduce exposures, whether it's diesel exhaust extraction systems, whether it's how we care for our turnouts, any of those kind of measures. We need to track fire environment exposures. So whether you create personal logs to where the firefighters track those, and I know that, in some of the cases that people they've had claims, they've had no records. The departments maybe had logs and there's no entry in those logs. So we really need to educate ourselves in using those. There are a number of exposure tracking softwares out there that you can subscribe to. Some of them are claiming they're working to couple with some of the NIFR reporting systems, that some of that data will come over into the tracking systems and will cue the firefighters to enter the job description or work description that they had and their exposures there, and their proper use of PPE. Highly consider the medical provider, that they understand the fire exposures and the importance of the narrative and the role that it plays in the process. That they just don't say that that somebody had a melanoma, that that the melanoma and their exposure risks were 400% greater than the general public, based upon the temperatures and the working environment and the location of around the neck or the face with a mask or those kind of things, so that their narratives are more in line with what the BWC will need. I know in my case, my dermatologist does not does not buy into that any skin cancer melanomas are connected to our job as firefighters. And when you determine those, they particularly look at DNA, and they look at the products of combustion that can cause those changes in our DNA structures, and that's what is the cancer-causing agents that turn them malignant, is the change in the DNA structure. So we're seeing the possibilities, we're seeing the increased chemicals that's doing that. My dermatologist, pretty much believes, for the most part, that the melanomas come pretty much from UA exposures. But when you look at the information about the UA exposures, ultraviolet light changes that DNA structure, and that's what's causing the cancer agents. So one of the things I know that the higher professional firefighters are talking about doing is to try to bring in some of the experts that they used with the testimony and some of the research, and maybe hold a conference for oncologists to come in and better understand what firefighters and what the fire service is up against with the exposures that we're currently seeing, in our occupation. One of the things that I think that was interesting, and it's before I go with questions in that, the last thing that I wanted to share was some of the data that we're at least getting out of BWC at this point. And one of the things in the actuaries that BWC had that we talked about with them when we met with them was the numbers. And they actually were talking like 586 potential claims annually to BWC, which we really questioned based upon even the numbers that they were using, saying of firefighters and retired firefighters in the state that might be available to submit a claim. So the first one was what was available in January 22nd of this year, was from the inaction of the claim in April to that date. And there were only a total of 42 claims that were filed. And one was due to dismissal. The number of injured workers in that time period was only 41. That shows a number of 37 that were actually state funded, and 5 were self-insured. And that 5 is self-insured. It would be large cities that undertake some of those expenses, or maybe all of the expenses, that they're self-funded by that city for a portion or all of their worker comp claims. And you can go down through and see where the appeals were. I asked for some updated information, and they weren't able to come back and give me the same information they did in January. But the other thing is that if you look at the total number that have been filed, currently of the 51 that have been filed, so we've only picked up 9 over that time period, in the 2-month time period. So if you look at that based upon the time that that the claim or the legislation went into an action, we've only accumulated 51 total filed claims. So BWC's assertion in their actuary saying that the potential was there and their concern for 586 claims. Certainly, we're way, way, way below that. So the costs are not going to be, at least initially, what they forecasted those costs to be. Presumption was met in 30 of the cases. Presumption not met in 17. And one of the things that I'd like to know is, as a result of that presumption not being met of the current data, is what caused that presumption to not be met? Was it, was it the use of tobacco? What was that particular cause? There's 3 new claims, and 1 was abated due to deaths. And so, any questions? And I can, don't know if I'll be able to hear you, but I can begin to see maybe some of the questions come up. Oh, Chief Westendorf. Chief Westendorf's questions was, are the diagnosis of cancer, assuming qualified, being treated as a workplace injury or disability? And what is the consequences for one or the other? I believe that the ones that have been qualified, so the ones that if you go back and you look at the ones that were presumption were met, that they are being treated as a workplace injury. And the ones that are not qualified, that presumption was not met, are probably being treated through the normal benefits that is provided through the employer. And of course, that would be with the career departments that are providing both worker comp benefits and insurance benefits, family benefits through there. And that was one of the things we had a lot of discussion about, was what was going to be the effect, because if certainly our premiums to the Bureau of Workers' Comp is less than what our premiums are to our family insurance. And if we shift, the cancer claims that a firefighter may have that are presumed and are allowed by BWC, those costs to BWC, could we see a reflection overall in our performance in our private insurance and maybe a reduction over time? And that's something, I don't know about that consequence, if we'll see that. I think that we probably will, as we see those that are not allowed. As we learn more and more about it, we see more research coming out, we probably may see a shift in those claims being approved by BWC. I hope that answers your question. Okay, I guess that was the only question out there. Again, thanks everybody. I didn't expect to see that we would have 33 attendees. It never crossed my mind, or I don't think it crossed Misha's mind, that when we scheduled this on Good Friday and probably in the middle of the spring break for a lot of people, that we would have even 33 people that would come online to listen to the program and that. So I appreciate it. Thanks for your participation. And really, we've got a great bunch of people in the Safety, Health, and Wellness Committee. So any of those work groups, anything that you're searching for, if we don't have it readily available, and we've developed quite an extensive library that we can use as resources. If we don't have it immediately available, I can almost bet that we've got somebody on the committee that'll know where you can go to find whatever resources you're looking for. So thanks for listening, and have a great Easter weekend.